A retired officer's prejudices versus the unshakable strength of a royal guard. Welcome to our channel. We're thrilled to have you here with us today. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of the exciting tales we have lined up, including tomorrow's special episode. We'd love to hear from you, so drop a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Your thoughts and feedback mean a lot to us. So sit back, relax, and get ready for today's incredible story. Thanks for being part of our journey, and we can't wait to share more with you. It was a crisp autumn morning at Buckingham Palace, and the usual bustle of tourists filled the air, their cameras flashing as they captured the grandeur of the royal residence. Amidst the excitement stood Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Carter, a tall and disciplined member of the British Royal Guard. At 6'2", Carter commanded attention, his scarlet tunic gleaming in the sunlight, the polished brass buttons reflecting the history and tradition he represented. The tall bearskin cap perched perfectly on his head, added to his already impressive stature. His posture was flawless, as though his very presence was a tribute to centuries of tradition. Carter stood motionless, as he had been trained to do, his white-gloved hands firmly holding his ceremonial rifle with precision. His gaze was unwavering, focused on a point in the distance, embodying the very essence of the Queen's Guard: duty, honor, and unyielding discipline. For Carter, this was not just a job, it was a legacy. A legacy rooted in values that transcended time and politics, values he had been taught to uphold since his early days in the military. As the tourists swarmed around him, excitedly snapping photos and discussing the history of the Royal Guards, Carter remained an unmoving figure in the midst of the crowd, a symbol of stability in a world of constant change. His heritage, his training, and his deep sense of duty had led him to this moment, standing as a sentinel at one of the most iconic landmarks in the world. His presence was a testament to the ideals that had defined the British military for centuries: respect, commitment, and excellence. But as Carter stood there, a figure of serenity amidst the chaos, an unexpected figure approached. Colonel John Richards, a retired officer, 72, walked into the courtyard with a stiff-legged gait. His once imposing figure was now slightly hunched, his military posture not quite what it used to be. The tweed jacket he wore showed signs of wear, and his regimental tie hung askew, revealing a man who was holding on to the past, clinging to the traditions he had spent decades upholding. His thinning white hair, though meticulously combed, had been disheveled by the wind, a stark contrast to Carter's immaculate appearance. Richards, who had served for 34 years in the British Army, had seen the changing tides of military culture and tradition. As he moved through the crowd, he couldn't help but voice his disapproval. He began loudly sharing his opinions with the tourists, recounting his days in the service with nostalgia and a touch of disdain for what he perceived as the dilution of tradition. The Queen's Guard, he declared to an American family, represents the finest qualities of British manhood. Men from the right families, proper British stock. Tradition matters. His comments grew increasingly louder, more critical. Richards didn't hide his discontent with the changes he saw around him. He spoke about how standards had slipped, how political correctness was undermining the military's once unquestionable authority. He seemed oblivious to the discomfort his words caused. Tourists exchanged awkward glances, some subtly stepping away from him, while others tried to tune him out. But Richards didn't notice. He was lost in his own memories, convinced that the world had forgotten the values he had fought to preserve. And then his gaze landed on Staff Sergeant Carter. Richards' eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of the young man standing guard. Carter's uniform, his posture, his very presence seemed to rub Richards the wrong way. For Richards, this was something new, something that didn't belong. His eyes lingered on Carter, his disapproval palpable as he continued his loud commentary. "That's certainly new," Richards muttered under his breath. His voice dropped, turning colder as he approached Carter's post. The tourists could sense the tension building as Richards, with a deliberate step, circled Carter, inspecting him with a critical eye. His words became more pointed, more invasive, testing Carter's resolve. Standards have certainly changed. Richards continued, his voice rising as he spoke about the proper bloodlines, and who could stand guard at such a prestigious post. His words were sharp, laced with veiled racism and condescension. Carter remained unmoved. His eyes stayed fixed on the distance, his body rigid with discipline. He didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge Richard's presence. He was, as always, the embodiment of the Queen's Guard, unshaken, unbothered by the provocations around him. The contrast between Richard's outburst and Carter's unwavering calm was stark. It was as if the world had split into two, one clinging to outdated beliefs and the other firmly rooted in the values of honor and respect, regardless of background. This moment, though seemingly simple, was about much more than just the confrontation between two men. It was a clash of ideals, of two perspectives on what tradition truly meant. Little did Richards know this would not be the end of the story. What happened next would leave him, and the crowd, stunned. The tension in the air was palpable. As Colonel Richards circled Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Carter, every step he took seemed to echo through the courtyard. The crowd of tourists had fallen silent, their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Some exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the conflict between the retired officer and the young, steadfast guard. Despite the growing discomfort around him, Carter didn't budge. His posture remained impeccable, his gaze unwavering. He stood as if he were carved from stone, a living monument to tradition and discipline. Richards continued his tirade, his voice growing louder as he pressed his attack. "You don't belong here," he muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Your kind doesn't have the history to stand guard at this palace. In my day, only the right kind of man was given such an honor." His words were sharp, each one aimed like a weapon at Carter's very identity. But Carter remained calm. His hands still gripped his ceremonial rifle, the white gloves pristine. His body standing perfectly straight, as if the insults hadn't even reached him. His breathing was measured, controlled, just as it had been trained to be in countless drills. No sign of anger, no flicker of frustration. Nothing but the exacting discipline of a soldier who had faced far more challenging situations than a retired officer's diatribe. The crowd could sense the mounting tension. A few tourists began to murmur among themselves, exchanging looks of confusion and discomfort. They had come to Buckingham Palace to witness the history and ceremony, but now they were seeing something they hadn't expected, something raw, something real. They had come to see a guard, standing still and unyielding, but they didn't realize how much this stillness would cost him in that moment, how much it would challenge the very traditions they thought they knew. Richards, however, was not so easily deterred. His eyes, narrowed with disdain, bore down on Carter as he continued to circle him. "You're nothing but a symbol of political correctness," he sneered, his words dripping with condescension. "A product of quotas, not honor. The real men who wore this uniform before you, they fought wars. They bled for this country. You think you can stand here pretending to carry their legacy?" At the mention of real men, Carter's jaw tightened imperceptibly. His heart rate remained steady, his focus absolute. He wasn't new to confrontation. He'd seen real combat, served with distinction in Afghanistan, and earned commendations under fire. He had endured much worse than this, and not once had he let his composure slip. Richards, sensing that he was getting under Carter's skin, leaned in closer, his face now inches from the guards. "What do you know of honor, boy? Your people, your ancestors, were once slaves. Now you wear the king's uniform as if it means something. You're a disgrace to it. You're a disgrace to everything this uniform stands for." His breath was heavy, his anger palpable, as if the words had been sew, building inside him for years. But Carter's silence was unbroken. Not a muscle twitched. His eyes stayed fixed on the distance, his body rigid with discipline. He didn't flinch, didn't acknowledge Richards's presence. He was, as always, the embodiment of the Queen's Guard, unshaken, unbothered by the provocations around him. The crowd, however, was not so indifferent. They watched as Richards grew more desperate, more agitated, his insults becoming louder and more direct. Some tourists were now stepping back, uncomfortable with the escalating confrontation. It was clear that Richards wasn't going to stop, but Carter wasn't about to react either. He stood still, like the very stone of the palace, rooted and unmoving. And then something changed. In the silence that followed Richards' final insult, a shift in the air was almost palpable. With a calmness that only seemed to amplify the growing tension, Carter slowly, deliberately turned his head. The movement was measured, precise, almost mechanical in its perfection. For a brief moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The tourists, the security personnel, and even Richards himself froze. No one expected Carter to react. No one expected this guard who had endured so much verbal abuse to finally break his silence. But when he did speak, his voice was calm, authoritative, and unwavering. "Colonel John Richards," Carter said, his tone even, "I believe we need to have a word." The crowd gasped. Richards, who had been expecting Carter to flinch, to lash out in anger, was now taken completely off guard. His face, which had once been a mask of arrogant confidence, began to falter. Carter's eyes locked onto his, sharp and piercing. "I know your record better than you might think, Colonel," Carter continued, his voice carrying the weight of years of training. "I know about the incidents in Cyprus, the disciplinary actions. Your promotion through the ranks wasn't earned by merit but by privilege." Richard stood frozen, his mouth slightly open as the truth of Carter's words hit him like a blow. Carter's voice, steady and measured, continued, recounting Richard's tarnished military career with surgical precision. "You were a poor officer, Colonel. Your personal prejudice undermined the cohesion of your unit. And your legacy is one of division, not unity. You are the embodiment of everything that is wrong with blind tradition." The word stung, sharper than any insult Richards had thrown. He stood there, speechless, unable to respond. Carter had done the impossible. He had taken Richards' venom and returned it, not with anger, but with truth. The crowd that had been watching in silence now began to murmur. The respect for Carter was growing as they witnessed not just a guard, but a man of character standing firm in the face of injustice. For the first time in the exchange, it was Richards who seemed to be losing control. He took a step back, his face pale, the fight draining out of him. The tourists who had been recording the entire confrontation now began to offer their silent approval, nodding, whispering among themselves. It was a moment that would resonate for years, a reminder that true tradition isn't defined by the color of one's skin or the era they were born into, but by the strength of their character. Carter, meanwhile, returned to his post with quiet dignity, the embodiment of the values he had just spoken about: honor, duty, and respect. And the courtyard, which had once been filled with tension, fell silent once again, this time in admiration. The air had grown thick with discomfort, the kind that hangs heavily in a room just before an argument explodes. The tourists stood, frozen, their cameras hanging forgotten in their hands, as the confrontation between Colonel Richards and Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Carter intensified. Richards, visibly shaken by Carter's calm but cutting response, wasn't ready to back down. His pride had been bruised, his authority challenged by a younger man whose mere presence seemed to defy everything Richards had come to believe about the military and tradition. "Do you really think you belong here, boy?" Richards' voice was a low growl now, no longer veiled by his previous polite veneer. His hands, which had once been clasped behind his back in a stance of superiority, now hung loosely by his sides, twitching with frustration. "You stand here in the uniform of the Queen's Guard, pretending to uphold the legacy of men who were born into privilege, not people like you." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous, targeting Carter's heritage with a venom that was hard to ignore. Carter, however, remained as still as ever, his eyes locked onto Richards. Unwavering. It was as if Carter's very being had become a shield against the barrage of disrespect being thrown his way. His hand still gripped the ceremonial rifle, his posture still perfect, and his mind was focused solely on the duty he was sworn to uphold. Richards, sensing that his earlier insults had barely made an impact, leaned in closer. His face now inches from Carter's. The proximity was a blatant violation of military protocol, but Richards didn't care. He was desperate to provoke a reaction, to see Carter, this symbol of change, flinch. You think you understand what it means to protect the crown? To uphold these traditions? Men like you don't belong in this uniform. Richards's voice was rising with each word, his temper now fully unleashed. Men of the right families, the right bloodlines are the ones who are supposed to wear this. You're just filling a quota, nothing more. The uniform demands respect and he spat the words like venom. You have no idea what it really means. The crowd around them had grown, people now pausing in their tracks, watching this disturbing exchange unfold. A few looked nervously at the nearby security, wondering when someone would step in, but none of them dared to interfere. They stood there, witnessing the raw collision of ideologies, the clash of old-world prejudices, and the quiet dignity of a soldier who had seen and done far more than Richards would ever understand. For a moment there was a lull. Richards stepped back, but only to take in Carter more thoroughly, as if searching for any sign of weakness, a crack in the perfect facade of discipline, but there was none. Carter's breathing remained steady, his body as rigid as the stone pillars surrounding them. The only thing that shifted was the intensity in Carter's gaze. His eyes, once fixed on the horizon, now locked directly onto Richards with a quiet strength that made the retired officer take an involuntary step back. Richards, now sensing that he was losing control of the situation, took a deep breath, as if trying to regain his composure. But the words that escaped his mouth were not composed. You should be grateful to stand here at all, he sneered. You should be thanking men like me for allowing you into this country, for giving you the chance to wear the king's uniform. The audacity of the remark struck the crowd like a lightning bolt. Some tourists began to murmur, shaking their heads in disbelief, others shifting uncomfortably, but none daring to speak up. They could sense that something significant was unfolding, something that went beyond this one confrontation. It was a moment that would become a living memory, one where Carter's actions would define a new understanding of tradition and respect. And then, in the midst of Richards's tirade, Carter spoke again, his voice as calm and collected as it had been throughout the entire ordeal. Colonel, let me remind you of something, he said, his tone never wavering. Tradition is not about bloodlines. It's about service, dedication, and excellence. The first black soldiers served with distinction in British regiments in the 1700s, long before you ever donned your uniform. They fought with honor, just as I do now. And the tradition I uphold is not one of race or privilege. It's one of merit. Richards faltered, his words momentarily lost. Carter's steady voice cut through his rhetoric, dismantling it piece by piece, exposing the flaws in his argument with an unmatched precision. I earned my place here, Carter continued, his gaze never leaving Richards. Not because of the color of my skin, but because of my actions, my commitment to this country. And I stand here as the embodiment of everything this uniform represents: discipline, duty, and respect for the crown. Richards's face drained of color, his previous arrogance slipping away, replaced by a faint hint of shame. The crowd, once nervous and unsure, began to shift. Some veterans who had been quietly observing the exchange straightened their backs, nodding in subtle approval of Carter's unwavering composure. Others who had been recording the confrontation on their phones now stopped, realizing that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. Richards took one last glance at Carter, his eyes filled with disbelief. The words he had clung to for so long, the traditions he had idolized, were now being rejected in front of him. He had tried to provoke Carter, but instead Carter had dismantled his world view, piece by piece, with nothing more than calm words and unshakable discipline. The courtyard, which had once been filled with the tense energy of the confrontation, now fell into a thick silence, broken only by the quiet hum of tourists' whispers. The scene had ended not with a fiery exchange, but with a simple, undeniable truth. Respect is earned, and Carter had earned it. The silence was thick, almost suffocating, as the tension between the two men hung in the air. Colonel Richards stood, motionless, his face a mixture of disbelief and fury, while Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Carter remained as still and composed as he had throughout the entire confrontation. The crowd, which had grown larger by the minute, was now fully aware that something monumental was unfolding before their eyes. This wasn't just a clash of military men, it was a clash of ideals, of tradition versus progress, of hate versus dignity. Richards, whose anger had reached a boiling point, stood there, seething, trying to regain some semblance of control. But Carter's calm, unwavering stance had broken him in ways Richards could not yet understand. He took a sharp breath and opened his mouth, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "You think you've won this, don't you?" He spat, his voice full of venom. "You think you've proven something today by standing there, pretending to be the face of British tradition. But you're nothing more than a token, a symbol for a new world order that's destroying everything this country was built upon." The crowd flinched at the intensity of his words, some visibly uncomfortable, others exchanging glances. But Carter, standing as steadfast as ever, didn't move a muscle. His expression remained unchanged, his eyes locked firmly on Richards, never showing a flicker of emotion, not even a hint of anger. Richards continued, his voice shaking with the raw frustration of a man who is being forced to confront the uncomfortable truth of his own biases. "You think you're a part of something greater, but you're just a product of political correctness, a pity case that's been handed a uniform. You don't understand the weight of what this represents," he said, his voice rising as if he were trying to convince himself of his own righteousness. But Carter's reply came swiftly, and with the same measured precision that had defined his every action thus far. "Colonel, I think it's clear now that you don't understand what this uniform represents," he began, his voice cool, but with an undeniable authority that made Richard's words seem small in comparison. "This uniform represents excellence, discipline, and duty. It represents service, not bloodlines. You talk about tradition, but tradition is about values, not color, not background, not who your ancestors were. It's about what you've done with your life, your actions, your service." The air around them seemed to crackle as Carter spoke, his words cutting through Richard's increasingly disjointed rhetoric like a laser. The crowd, once uncertain, now stood in rapt attention. No one dared to speak, to breathe, as Carter's response to Richards's venomous accusations echoed in the courtyard. "Let me remind you, Colonel," Carter continued, his tone calm but firm, "that the first black soldiers served with distinction in British regiments centuries ago. They fought, bled, and died for this country, just like the men you claim to honor. And they wore this uniform with pride. They didn't wear it because of their bloodlines. They wore it because of their actions, because of their commitment to duty to the crown. And that is exactly why I wear it." Richards took a step back, his face growing pale as the full force of Carter's words landed. He had spent so long believing that tradition and honor were bound by blood, that they were something inherited. But Carter had just shattered that belief with simple, undeniable facts. Richards had no response, no retort that could erase the truth that Carter had just laid bare for all to see. The tension in the courtyard had reached its peak. Richards, his face now flushed with a mixture of humiliation and anger, took another shaky step back. His eyes, which had once been filled with disdain, now seemed to search for something, anything to regain his footing, to reclaim the pride that had been stripped away so effortlessly by a younger man who was not only his equal, but, in that moment, his superior. But Carter didn't waver. His eyes remained locked on Richards, steady and unyielding. "You may have served your time, Colonel, but your time is over. This is a new era, one where true tradition is defined by the strength of character, not by the color of your skin or your family's history. And that, Colonel, is the legacy I will leave behind. Not the one you've clung to in your mind, but the one that truly matters, the legacy of service, of sacrifice, and of honor. The crowd, which had been silent throughout the exchange, now began to stir. A few people murmured in approval, others exchanged quiet nods. The weight of Carter's words had resonated far beyond Richard's. It was a moment of reckoning, not just for the retired officer, but for everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. Carter, having made his point, turned slightly, his posture perfect, and returned to his post. The stillness that followed was almost palpable, the quiet hum of the crowd filling the space around him. The tourists who had come to see the pomp and circumstance of the Queen's Guard had instead witnessed a living example of true courage, true honor, and true tradition. It was a moment they would not soon forget. As the crowd began to disperse, many gave Carter a silent nod of respect, a gesture that spoke volumes. Richards, meanwhile, was left standing in the middle of the courtyard, his shoulders slumped, his head down, the weight of his own words now hanging heavily on him. He had tried to provoke a response, to tear down a man he had deemed unworthy of the uniform. But it was Richards who had been stripped bare, his prejudices laid out for all to see. And as the sun continued to cast long shadows across Buckingham Palace, it became clear that the true legacy of the Queen's Guard was not found in bloodlines, but in the strength, integrity, and character of those who stood watch. The silence lingered in the air long after Staff Sergeant Nathaniel Carter returned to his post, his stance unwavering. The perfect picture of discipline and dignity. Colonel Richards stood frozen in the courtyard, his pride shattered, his once unshakable beliefs about tradition and hierarchy unraveling before the eyes of an ever-growing crowd. The tension was thick, but Carter's composed response had made one thing clear. The world had changed, and Richards had not. The tourists who had been watching the confrontation with wide eyes now began to stir. Some were whispering to one another, their words hushed but laden with disbelief. Others, clearly moved by the scene, gave Carter quiet nods of respect as they passed by. It wasn't just the display of military discipline they had witnessed. It was a lesson in grace under pressure, in maintaining one's composure and honor, despite the most caustic provocations. Carter had not only defended his honor, he had redefined it for everyone present. But Richards, still reeling from the verbal blow he'd just received, remained in the middle of the courtyard, his body stiff, his posture broken. His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by a creeping doubt that gnawed at him. His once firm grip on the ideals of tradition had slipped, and in its place was a profound sense of isolation. He looked around, his eyes scanning the tourists, who had been silently observing, but instead of admiration he saw pity. His breathing quickened, his heart pounding in his chest, but there was no escape from the truth that Carter had so calmly laid bare. The legacy of British military tradition was not defined by bloodlines, or who could trace their family's history back to a time of empire. It was defined by character, by service, and by the willingness to stand firm in the face of adversity. Richards had tried to break Carter's resolve, to bring him down with nothing but words, but it was Richards who had been exposed as weak. As Carter continued to stand at attention, his eyes forward, perfectly still, a subtle shift took place. In the crowd around him, the tourists who had been observing the exchange now stood with newfound respect. A few older veterans who had been watching the scene unfold from the sidelines nodded their approval. They had seen what Carter had done. He had stood his ground, not with violence or aggression, but with the quiet, unshakable strength of a man who knew exactly who he was and what he stood for. Carter's composed response had done more than just silence Richards. It had given the crowd something they hadn't expected to see that day. A powerful lesson in dignity, humility, and respect. The Queen's Guard, as represented by Carter, was not some outdated symbol of privilege. It was a living embodiment of the values that made the British military great: courage, honor, and unwavering discipline. For the first time in the confrontation, Richard seemed to realize that he had no allies here. The words he had used to justify his views, to hold on to his fading sense of superiority, were falling on deaf ears. The tourists were no longer quietly watching. They were now engaged, exchanging glances, some even shaking their heads at the bitterness and ignorance that had fueled Richard's attack. Modern sensibilities, Richards muttered under his breath, but his voice was weak, lacking the strength it had carried before. He looked around, his eyes darting from one person to another, but no one met his gaze. The crowd had shifted. What had once been a silent audience was now a group of people who had borne witness to a moment of real change, a moment where the very fabric of tradition had been tested and proven true, not in the dusty corners of the past, but in the present, with a young man standing tall in the face of disrespect, security, which had been keeping a watchful eye on. The scene from a distance began to move in. Two plainclothes officers approached, their steps deliberate but calm, signaling to Richards that it was time for him to leave. He had made his point, and now the crowd had made theirs. As they escorted him from the palace grounds, Richards didn't protest, his shoulders sagging as the weight of his words and his actions began to sink in. His time had passed, and he was left to wrestle with the reality that the world had moved on, leaving him behind. Carter, for his part, didn't acknowledge the departure of Richards. He didn't need to. His duty was to remain still, to embody the values he had just spoken of, values that were not shaped by the color of one's skin or the history of one's family, but by the strength of one's character. As the crowd slowly dispersed, many of them continued to glance back at Carter, now fully aware of the depth of what they had just witnessed. It was a story they would tell for years to come, a story of how one man stood tall, not just as a soldier, but as a symbol of a new kind of strength, one that was defined not by the past, but by the courage to face the future with dignity and respect. And as Carter remained at his post, the sun casting its golden rays on his red tunic, the tourists who had once been mere onlookers now understood the true meaning of the Queen's Guard. It was not about bloodlines or traditions of the It was about the courage to honor those traditions by standing firm, regardless of the challenges that might come. It was about what you did in the face of adversity, and how you carried yourself when the world was watching. Carter's legacy, built on dignity and discipline, had been cemented that day, not just in the eyes of the tourists, but in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. And for Richards, there would be no easy way to forget the lesson he had learned, standing in the shadow of a man who knew that true tradition was not defined by race or privilege, but by the strength of character. If you've made it this far into the story, we'd love to hear your thoughts on what just happened. Was the way Staff Sergeant Carter handled the situation with Colonel Richards something you expected? What do you think about how he stood his ground with such grace and discipline, despite the racial slurs and disrespect? It's not every day we get to witness a moment of such unshakable dignity, and the powerful lesson it teaches us about honor, tradition, and character. So take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. We want to know what this story means to you, and how it might change the way you think about the values of respect and equality. Do you think Carter's response could serve as an example for all of us in facing adversity and prejudice? Let's keep the conversation going. Your opinions and reflections are incredibly important to us, and we're excited to read your responses. Also, if you appreciated this story and its message, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss out on our next thought-provoking video. Share this with someone who might need to hear it too.